Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. This is Mark from ACRL and Choice. And on behalf of ACRL and Choice and the others on this call, I would like to welcome you to our presentation today, which is Impacts and Consequences of the Coronavirus Pandemic, OECD's Data, Analysis, and Recommendations, which is supported today by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library and research communities. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions and important new issues and developments in academic librarianship and the wider research community by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd just like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentations. Along the right-hand side, you should see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you click the little arrows beside those, you can collapse and expand them to see what's coming through the chat and the Q&A. Please use the Q&A panel to ask questions of our panelists. We'll take some time at the end to answer just a few questions, really as many as we have time for. So if you've got questions for our panelists today, please drop those into the Q&A. If you're having any technical issues, that's what you can use the chat for. That will message me directly. So please send any of those issues to me through the chat. All right. Also note that we are recording today's session and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. Our presenters today are Monica Quisser and Ida Caldera Sanchez. Monica is the Senior Counselor to the Director of Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs Directorate and the Head of Social Policy Division at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where she supervises and coordinates the work on social protection, social indicators, pensions, affordable housing, and family policies. She's been working at the OECD since 1997. And Ida is the Economic Counselor to the OECD Chief Economist. In this capacity, she supports the Chief Economist to advance and provide strategic direction to the Economics Department's work and heads the Chief Economist Office, leading a team of economists carrying out work for the G20, the OECD Economic Outlook, and other flagship publications. In addition to our guest speakers, OECD provides multiple access points to their research and data. In addition to the COVID-19 and policy trackers hubs, the OECD iLibrary data.oecd.org and stats.oecd.org provide additional interactions and research resources depending on your needs. For more information on these resources, please contact Ian Williamson at ian.williamson@oecd.org. Links and emails will be provided at the end of this webinar. All right, and that's enough from me. So we will turn over the presentation to our first speaker, which is Ida. Let me just pull up that deck and we will jump right in. Here you go, Ida.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that nice introduction, and good afternoon to all of you who are out there participating in this virtual event. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to offer some thoughts on how the pandemic is affecting the global economy. Then I will discuss how governments are dealing with it. And then I will conclude by offering some thoughts about how the pandemic could have longer-term implications for how the economies work. So Let me start by discussing how the pandemic is affecting economies around the world. As you know, countries are making progress in containing the virus by putting in place a number of social distancing and mobility measures. So these figures, what it shows is the share of OECD and G20 countries that have implemented measures to limit the mobility of people as well as activity. The levels, you can see here my arrow, so the levels range from 0, no limitations, to 5, which accounts for lockdowns affecting the whole country. So for instance, if you take France, which is the country that I am right now, this would fall under level 5, because France has implemented a nationwide confinement where most people, we were asked to stay home until yesterday. Another example, if you look at the other spectrum, is the case of Sweden, which would fall under level 1, where people with symptoms have been urged to avoid social contact, and where all people above 70 have been encouraged to remain isolated. So all these measures are helping to contain the virus and to bend the pandemic curve, which is good news for the economy and for the society as a whole. Now, moving to the next slide and to discussing what are the effects that we are seeing of these containment measures on the economy. What we see from the economic indicators that we are getting more and more every day, we see that the containment measures are creating a huge economic impact on activity that goes beyond what we saw during the global financial crisis. When you look at the figure on the left, which shows business surveys indicators for manufacturing and services in China, the euro area, and the US, what you can see is that there's been a plunge in those survey indicators. And when you look at the right-hand side, you see that we've seen a similar dramatic drop in terms of consumption in China, the US, and the euro area. So we are seeing a collapse in demand as a result of the containment measures, which is also leading to a shocking rise in unemployment, as Monica will describe later on. Moving on, all sectors are being affected by the social distancing and mobility restrictions, but services are particularly being affected because they often involve direct contact between customers and providers, and also because they typically gather people in public places. So as an illustration, what I have put up here is a chart that shows how flights, international flights, have fallen worldwide since the beginning of the year, as an illustration of the impact that we are seeing on the services sectors around the world. Now, moving on, as I said, the impact of these containment measures on the global economy is going to be very large. On the left-hand side, you can see the numbers that we are getting for GDP for the first quarter of 2020. And what we see is that economic activity has declined substantially, with the largest fall for China, which is the country that implemented earliest the lockdown, but also across the other economies. So for OECD economies as a whole, on the right-hand side, you can see an estimate that we have done of the initial impact, the direct impact of the lockdown, and how it will affect GDP. And what we have estimated is that these initial lockdowns are going to lead to a drop in economic output in the order of 25%, which is very large. And this would imply an annual drop in GDP of about 2 percentage points per month of containment. As I said, the data that we have on the right-hand side is for the first quarter, which already shows a big impact. And it's likely that the impact that we will see over the next quarter is going to be even larger, as more countries around the world have started to implement more generalized shutdowns. Now, moving on to the financial sector. So what we are seeing is that the financial markets are under strain. One of the biggest fault lines that I would like to put the focus on is the amount of debt that has accumulated in the financial system since the global financial crisis. On the left-hand side, you can see that the issuance of corporate bonds has grown very rapidly across the world in the last 10 years. It has, in fact, doubled to an overall total of 14 trillion outstanding debt. This is very, very large. And on the right-hand side, what you can see is that adding to these concerns is a large proportion of this debt is rated as BBB. So this is the red line. So this is the lowest investment grade. So what is the worry here? The worry is that in the case of that we see large downgrades of these BBB rated bonds to non-investment grade, financial institutions would be no longer wanting to hold these bonds, and they would be forced to a sell-off, affecting financial markets significantly. Now, moving on to, I discussed the effect on the world economy, but I would like now to take a moment to discuss the effect that the pandemic is having on emerging economies. So emerging economies are being hit by multiple shocks. So besides the health challenges that they are facing with dealing with the virus and the fact that they typically have weaker health systems, they are also experiencing other troubles. For instance, they are experiencing large capital outflows, as you see on the left-hand side, which are much larger than what we saw during the global financial crisis. This is the blue line, or during the taper tantrum in 2013. So these are very massive outflows. At the same time, we see that many emerging economies are experiencing, well, we see a fall in commodity prices, and this is affecting emerging economies in particular. And moreover, a large amount of the debt that they accumulate is in dollars, and many have limited fiscal space. So the situation is very difficult. Now, after going over the economic situation, I will discuss what policy measures governments are putting in place to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. As I said, the changes and the speed of the economic effects are very, very large. But at the same time, governments around the world have also intervened quite rapidly and massively to contain the shock and support workers and firms. In this slide that I put up here, I summarize what are the most common types of support governments are providing. I'm not going to go through all of them, but in general, most governments have provided first support to the health sector in terms of material, equipment, increasing the number of staff, as well as support to households and firms. This can be either through income support measures or short-term working schemes, etc. And also, most states are guaranteeing backed loans as well as credit lines to firms. And finally, central banks are providing monetary policy or liquidity support to their economies, banks, and firms. Moving a bit forward and focusing on the fiscal support, as you can see on this figure that shows the total amount of the fiscal packages across a number of economies, you can see that these are very large and diverse, and in many cases, the size goes beyond what we saw for the global financial crisis. Moving on to monetary policy, as I said, central banks have also reacted quite aggressively and with an unprecedented stimulus. In many cases, they have cut policy rates and have done large purchases of sovereign and private assets. So overall, the support that governments and central banks are providing to the economy and to shield people and firms is massive and in a very large scale and generally quite well targeted. Now, I wanted to conclude by providing some thoughts about how the pandemic may change the way how economies function, because we are already seeing some of those changes. First of all, it may lead to a reassessment of globalization. So we have seen that the shutdown of entire industries and countries has significantly disrupted global value chains. And in the future, firms may re-examine how their supply chains work to avoid depending on one specific country or a supplier and reduce the risks. Also, there may be a shift to a local production in some critical industries, like for instance, healthcare or pharmaceuticals. And we may also see less movement of people as international travel may be changed for quite some time. The second area what I wanted to discuss is that we may see an acceleration of the digital transition that we were already seeing. First, we are seeing, because of the pandemic, a massive acceleration towards digital platforms and channels for buying, for learning, etc. And we have also seen a rise in teleworking, and this may lead to more permanent changes and the move away from jobs to from metropolitan areas to other parts in countries. And then, as I said, greater delivery of local education and other public services, etc. Third, there may be a change in a greater preference for public goods. Perhaps, as we have seen, there will be an increase in the worries about climate change, which may lead to the implementation of more measures to deal with climate and to mitigate the impact that that's having on the economy and on people. And finally, cities may change significantly the way how cities are currently organized. At the moment, because of social distancing, there are already been changes that are taking place. For instance, some cities are closing streets to cars to create more space, etc. And these may become more permanent, as well as we are seeing the rethinking of some large events, like for instance, the Olympics. So these will all change the way how may change the way how economies function and will lead to longer-term implications of the pandemic. And with that, I would like to close there and hand it over to you back, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ada. All right. And at this point, we are transitioning over to Monica. So I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, and hello from me as well to everybody. I'm delighted to be here today, and I will pick up from where Ida left us with a little bit more information on what has been happening in the labor markets, and then also look at some of the particular effects. We've done some research on how this pandemic has been affecting women in particular, because we're very worried, and many governments of the OECD are very worried about the gendered impact that this pandemic is having, potentially making gender inequalities larger and worse, and also on children who in many cases are already among the most vulnerable members of our societies. So we'll look into all of this into a little bit more detail, and I will, like Ida, I will also tell you a little bit more about what our member countries have been doing in terms of measures. Now, let me say at the outset right away that I can only cover a small amount of all the information we have, just like Ida. She has lots and lots more, I can tell you. So we will make sure that you have all the links to additional information and to our extensive policy briefs. And there you will find much more and references to further reading on any of these specific areas that you might be interested in, because the entire OECD is currently working on these issues. And we've already produced, I think today, the last number I had was 70 different policy briefs covering literally every area that the OECD is working on. So with that as an introduction, let me follow with a little bit more here on the labor markets. Here we go. Now, labor markets are already taking the toll, and most of you listening in today here are from the United States. So we've brought the first number here on the United States, saying that this is really one of the worst situations one could possibly imagine. In the United States, we now have more than 7 weeks of massive inflows into unemployment insurance, totaling over 30 million new claims. And you can see here on this chart, you can see that there were up to 6 million new claims in some weeks. So that is really, really enormous. And the bad news of this number is actually that this is likely underestimating the actual number of job seekers, because many people have not been able to file a claim. And the Economic Policy Institute in the US actually did an online survey in mid-April, which suggested that for every 10 people who had filed for unemployment benefits in the previous month, you had about 3 to 4 additional people who applied but could not get through the system because they were kicked out of the online, and 2 more who chose not to apply because they thought it was too difficult to go through the process and probably thought that their chances of not getting through would be quite slim, and that's why they more or less gave up. Now, a piece of good news is that we have nearly 80% of the job seekers that report that they're on temporary layoff. That means that they might be hired again or by their previous employers once economic activity picks up. But then, of course, we really don't know, as Ida already pointed out, we don't know quite how big this pickup is going to be and when it's going to be, because right now nobody really knows for some of the key sectors like hospitality, like tourism, like cultural activities, at what point people can start going into those jobs again. Now, going beyond the United States, I've also brought you some more numbers from other countries, your neighboring country, Canada. There you see that there were 2.13 million new claims in the first 2 weeks of March, which is equivalent to the entire total for 2018-19. In Norway, just in the first 3 months, there were double the amount of claims as the entire last year, and in the UK, 10 times more than in normal times. Then, and this is what I just mentioned, there's also some quite good news on short-term work schemes. These short-term work schemes are something that is used quite heavily in European countries. Sometimes it's also called furlough schemes. These are schemes where the government actually pays part of the worker's salary, or in some cases actually they've now stepped it up to all of workers' salary during a time of what they call a kind of a technical or partial unemployment. And the whole idea is to keep people on staff and have the government step in for a while to pay for their wages. And then when this situation gets better again, then the staff are still there, can go back to working again. And so France, for example, uses this a lot. At the moment, there's half of all private sector employees are actually on this short-time work scheme, which the French call partial unemployment. In Germany, there's also over 750,000 company claims for this reduced working hours for a total of 10 million workers. This is 20 times the largest increase during the great financial crisis. And in Italy, you have almost 30% of the labor force that is also in these type of schemes. Now, the big question is, of course, how you transition out of those schemes when recovery then comes. So far, in some of the European countries, the short-time work has prevented a massive rise in unemployment. And here you can see on the left-hand side, and I would like to point out this is really important for those of you who might want to report on this. These are very provisional estimates, because what happens is that the standard labor force survey data, which we use at the OECD to calculate and compare labor force statistics across countries, they're still not ready. So we have to kind of estimate these things just on the basis of the number of inflows into unemployment benefits and short-term work that we showed you on the previous slide. So please take this with a large grain of salt and see this just as an indication. And so on the left-hand side, you can see that unemployment rates have been really soaring for countries like the United States, Ireland, or Israel, where some rates are already above 15 or 20% in April. And on the right-hand side, you can see that we have similar numbers for some of the European countries, but not on unemployment, but actually on large short-time work schemes, for example, Belgium, France, Germany, or Italy. So it's quite logical that you don't see those high unemployment rates in those countries because they're using these short-time work schemes instead. Then there's a question whether COVID-19 can be considered as the great leveler, as something that, as an event, since it touches literally everybody in every country, everywhere around the world, in all kinds of different sectors, whether this actually might lead to a reduction of all those inequalities that we have been seeing growing over the past decades. Now, this graph, as you can see here, is something we borrowed from the Canadian economist called Miles Korak, and it shows you how unequal the crisis impact so far has been for white-collar compared to blue-collar workers. So the white-collar workers are here shown here in red. Those are accommodation, food, and services industry, which tend to be more low-skilled and low-paid jobs. And the blue line are professional, scientific, and the technical service industry. And you can see here in this graph, when you look at the red line, that the month of March has wiped out all of the employment gains that were made in the accommodation and food services industry over a period of 20 years. And if you look at the blue curve in comparison, there's no such drop. It just keeps, there's a small drop at the end where it's really plummeting on the red line. But you can see that for overall, for that group of employees, things have still been going reasonably well. Now, the big question is, of course, how will the crisis feed through also into those industries that are included in the blue line? But what I think this shows you clearly, at least in the short and probably medium term, is that some workers are clearly much more affected than others, and some have more economic immunity than others. And this is looking just at sectors. Obviously, if you look at the situation between unemployed and self-employed people, employed and self-employed people, there is also large inequalities. Now, moving to one of the groups that I mentioned before that are particularly at risk, as we found in our work at the OECD, that's women. And that is related both to their work at home and in paid work. So obviously, the first threats, as I explained before, come from the confinement and distancing measures. But then, as she also said, jobs that rely on travel and on physical interaction with customers are the ones that are the most affected, obviously. So that's air travel, tourism, retail, and then also accommodation services like hotels and food and beverage activities, for example, cafes, restaurants, and catering. And here on this graph, you can see this is accommodation, food and beverage, so basically hospitality. And you can see that in the US, for example, women represent 53% of workers in accommodation and food, and which I didn't bring here, but 52% of workers in retail. So more women affected, even though the difference isn't huge, but clearly there are more women than men affected. And women are also quite overrepresented among many of the essential service workers. Now, the first sector that comes to mind, obviously, is the health sector. So doctors, nurses, particularly long-term care staff, all of that is much more, the overwhelming majority of those workers are female. So in OECD countries, for example, you have women making up half of all doctors, but worldwide, 2/3 of the health workforce are females, and 90% of the long-term care workers. But then you also have other essential service workers like cleaning staff and so on, which very often are women as well. Now, it doesn't stop at the workplace because, as we all know, women are shouldering the bulk of additional unpaid work at home. And this is something that COVID has only made worse because even before the crisis, women already did twice the childcare and spend as much as 2 hours more on unpaid work each day on average than men, 2 hours more. And now, with schools closing and childcare facilities closing, the women are adding schooling and childcare at home to this already difficult situation. So they have to supervise homeschooling, and it seems from early evidence that this is falling more on women than on men. But at the same time, we have to say that maybe there's also a glimmer of hope in this situation, since men are also confined with their families. We hope that maybe some of them will also see this as an opportunity to connect more with their families, with their children in this unpaid work space, and also do more of the homework supervision and become more engaged in unpaid work at home. So we should always remain optimistic that this might be the case. Now, one very serious situation which we've seen evolving here and during the lockdown, and this is something that's happening in all countries, unfortunately, is the increase of violence against women, which people are also calling the other pandemic. And this is something that already was shockingly prevalent in many countries, and almost most countries, and across all social classes and all groups. That's become worse through the lockdown because women and children that are exposed to the situation are locked down with the perpetrators. And so many countries have been starting to do to invent new services with code words for women going to pharmacies. They've been seeing that these calls to shelters and so on have been going down dramatically compared to usual times, and that's probably because many of the families who are being affected, the women and children, are not able to contact those protection services as they could before, because they're under supervision. They might have just one computer at home, and it's very hard for them to get the help they need and get out of that situation. So this is something that the OECD is also working on, and this is certainly something where we, I think, have to learn the lessons from this situation to do something in a more structural way about the terrible situation of exploding violence against women. Now, if we turn to children, children are also very, very vulnerable. Here I've brought for you just to illustrate, and there's a long brief where you have plenty more information on different aspects of the vulnerability of children during this crisis. Here's the percentage of 15-year-olds from our PISA study, which I'm sure many of you know. This is basically assessing learning skills and results for 15-year-olds. And it's also looking at their situation by socioeconomic status. And you can see in this graph that on average across the OECD, 87% of 15-year-olds have access to desk and a quiet place to study at home. So which is pretty good news. I would say 87% doesn't sound so bad. But if you look at the US numbers, which US is on the right-hand side, the third country from the right, it's only 73%. And if you disaggregate further and look at the different socioeconomic classes, you can see that among children from the lowest socioeconomic group, that's only 53% that have access to a desk and a quiet place to study, whereas it's close to 100% for kids that come from rich families. So you can see there immediately how there's a huge risk in this school closure and lockdown situation of socioeconomic differences in learning, in child development, in developing abilities, is going to increase the risk of largening inequalities further. And remote education is, of course, something that many countries, almost all countries locking down, have been trying. But then again, there's another risk here that, of course, in children with wealthier parents likely have their own computer. They have a place where to go to connect. They don't have to share the computer with their parents, who are also teleworking, which is often the case in poorer families. And so if this goes on for very long, then there's a real worry in many countries that those children that don't have these optimal learning conditions at home will slowly fall behind, and it's going to be difficult to make up for that lost time. Like for women, we also see a potential increase in child maltreatment, child abuse, and some children which were already in a very, very difficult situation before the COVID hit. For example, children in foster care, in detention, migrant children, for example, and in homeless families are even more vulnerable and really belong to the highest risk groups here. And another thing to take into account is that now that everything has been dominated by COVID and many people have not been going to the doctor and not been seeking medical help for either chronic diseases or for vaccines, there's also 170 million children in the world at risk of missing their measles vaccines. And so that has potentially also has a long-term effect. Now, let me go quickly through some of the we've identified 6 policy pillars which countries should be working on. And Ida's already mentioned some of them in her presentation, so I'll go quickly. The first measure, obviously, in protecting people is to reduce workers' exposure to COVID. Telework is one of the things you mentioned, but then assisting SMEs who maybe have not, small and medium-sized enterprises, who don't have that telework capacity to build it up, increase the health and safety requirements, then give income support to sick or quarantined workers. This was particularly important in the beginning when people had to go into quarantine and employers maybe they didn't have sick leave or not enough left or were not in an employment situation that even offered that. So it was important for companies to give that income support and if needed for governments to reimburse employers for that in that situation if they were not able to pay for this. Then very important, related to what I just said about women and children, helping families deal with unforeseen care needs. So through alternative care arrangements, financial subsidies to employers who provide their workers with paid leave, and adapting telework requirements to workers' caring responsibilities. So not to expect parents to work a 9-to-5 job when they're also homeschooling and doing other caring jobs. And short-time work, I already explained that this is something that particularly European countries have been using a lot. Then they've made it easier in many cases to get into those schemes, also for companies and for workers. They've simplified the procedures. They're also promoting companies to use this time now to promote online training. Then income support directly to workers who losing their jobs or self-employment income. There are, despite very extensive social safety nets and social protection systems in many OECD countries, there are still very many workers who end up falling in the cracks of these systems. And so self-employed, for example, are at particular risk. The culture sector, for example, where it's not clear at all when this will open up again. And even film productions and theaters, it's very, very difficult to see how, with social distancing rules, they can be working again. And many of these people can drop very easily from a situation where they were relatively well paid and well off into a situation where from one day to the next they have no more income at all. So this has been a focus of many countries to give this group of people, workers, good support. And finally, and I also mentioned this already, that governments have been giving financial support to firms who were affected by a drop in demand by helping them defer the tax and social security payments that are due and also supporting their liquidity. And this is, of course, also a big focus of the US program. For women and children, some of this I already mentioned. For policy responses for women, and this is more in a medium and longer term perspective, not only for the crisis, that one should use gender impact assessments and tools in the situation of emergency management, gender budgeting, meaning that with every new measures that governments are taking, they should just stop and think a minute about how this might affect women and men differently. Ensure that women are well covered by more general emergency measures. Then, as I said, more support for victims of domestic violence. And I think we also need to think out of the box here and find some new ways, like, for example, the Spanish government instituted a new code word that women could say in pharmacies, which alerted the pharmacist to the situation. When she asks for a mask and says mask 19, that means that she needs help, and then that alerted pharmacist to contact the authorities and provide help for this for women in this particular situation. And of course, as always, we need more women's voices in decision-making processes. And there's been some talk about some countries where expert panels and so on were devising policy were actually made up of 90% men, and that women's concerns were not heard enough. For children, food assistance is very important because of school closures. Many children are lacking school meals, and these are very important, and parents not always in a situation to help them. Then just for women, immediate assistance and protection for emergency situations, mental health problems that are emerging due to confinement. And this is, of course, not specific to children. This also affects adults, and this is something we have to be very careful about. Then help parents who need specific support for education of disadvantaged children. Often these children were in schools, and suddenly parents find themselves in a situation where they have to provide that training in daily schooling, which is so much more difficult than even with children who are less disadvantaged. So there it's very important to give parents more support. Children are online a lot more now, so we need a step-up protection in the digital environment to make sure that we know what they're doing and that they stay out of harm's way. And then more broadly, also efforts to combat child poverty. Poor children are, of course, not living alone mostly, luckily, but poor children live in poor households. So this makes the link back again to supporting workers in these exceptional times. So that was it from me. Here you have the links to all of our policy briefs. We have a new one coming out later this week on income support. So stay with us, and I'd like to invite you all to go to our website and take a look at many studies and many more information that you'll. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Monica. This is Mark Dirks from ACRLN Choice. We have some time here at the end of the presentation for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A module, and we will start out with a few questions that have already come in. All right. It looks like we have a couple of questions here for Ida to start out. The first question that we have for you, Ida, is what more does the OECD want to see from governments? And I think, Ida, you might be, there you go.
Yeah. So thank you so much for everyone for your attention and also for this question. So as I described already during my presentation, we've seen that governments have put in place what I've called an unprecedented fiscal and monetary support. Those packages are very large and have been provided very swiftly. So for me, what I would highlight in terms of the key challenge is that governments should limit to the extent they can that the pandemic leads to lasting scars on people and on businesses. What do I mean by these lasting scars? So this is an increase in unemployment that is sustained over time. We heard from Monica that there are a number of people who are more vulnerable to the pandemic, so children that are, they are not attending a school. So this may lead to them falling down in terms of education and then in society. So all those scars, they should be avoided. And what can governments do? First of all, they should maintain the supported fiscal and monetary policy package as they put in place. So there is a durable recovery. And then if there is a situation in which we are hit by another virus, this probably we will need additional stimulus, both in terms of fiscal policy, but also monetary policy. As I said, these are large support, but I think is needed given the large impact that the pandemic is having on the economy.
Excellent, thank you. And it looks like we have a question here for Monica as well. And that question is, Thinking beyond the short-term crisis, how do you think businesses and nonprofit organizations will change permanently in the wake of the pandemic?
That's a really good question, and I think the verdict is out. It's hopefully, I think, a lot of things about the way we work, about the way we look at business, about the way we think about different professions will change after this crisis. But I think all of us have to really work hard to make that happen. Let me give you a few examples. For businesses, the one key thing that I think in many countries businesses have understood now is that for many people, telework is possible. And now for many of you in the US, this might sound bizarre because the US has always been kind of a leader in that respect, and having a home office is nothing spectacular. But there's many countries where there was still much more of a culture of being present and not trusting maybe the employees as much that they would be working well at home, or giving the possibility only to selected staff. Now that everybody's teleworking, people are seeing how possible this is. And while it's not always fun and we all miss seeing our colleagues face to face, I think this is really something where in many countries people are realizing that they may want to make more use of it. Another point is, for example, how working methods might change is maybe people are going to spend a lot of less money on flying around the world for meetings, including people coming to the OECD or OECD staff going around the world, because we all see that one can have quite efficient and effective meetings through digital tools like Zoom or WebEx, what we're doing right now. So that's another area where I think things may change, and that again then might have an impact on the environment, because reducing travel and already we're seeing, for example, in France, that the Minister of Finance was considering forbidding inner French flights where people could go also by train. So kind of say you don't have to take a plane to go to a place where there's a train that takes you maybe at the same in the same amount of time, considering the transport to and from airports and the check-in times. So those are little examples how businesses might change. In NGOs, I think might also change in the sense that we have seen often that NGOs are active in areas where the most vulnerable need protection, and the NGOs have become very, very important partners in this work and delivering services to the people who need them most. And in many countries, there's been an outbreak of good examples of solidarity, people helping each other in a very, people sewing masks or printing 3D visors and doing other things, bringing food to people who are isolated and locked down, and helping the homeless, for example. So I think there might be, and I hope it lasts after the crisis, also much more of an understanding how important those services are, and maybe also more volunteering in the longer term, and more support for NGOs as very important delivery partners in social protection.
Thank you. And yes, let's hope that some of the more hopeful outlooks there really do come about. That's great. We have another question here for Ida. And the question is simply, how can academics and universities play a role in better understanding the effect of COVID-19 on the economy and potentially provide useful policy responses?
Thank you, Mark. I think this is quite a good question. And as I have highlighted during my presentation, I think that there's quite a lot of uncertainty about the virus, how is it spreading, the impacts that it will have, how the measures that governments are putting in place will impact the economy. And there's also a lot of uncertainty about how many deaths this is creating and, the material that is needed. So I think what academics can help with is to help us answer all these unknowns that we are all facing, not only governments, but also think tanks like us. So collecting data, doing good analysis, that would all be very helpful for all of us because we are living through an unprecedented time. We've never faced a pandemic of this size with having such a large impact affecting the whole world. So data and analysis would be very useful. Thanks.
Excellent. And we have a question here for Monica as well. Do you have any data on competition, or I think maybe compensation and or tipping, and the impacts or the prevalence of gig working? So I think the question there really is, do you have any information on how all of this is affecting tipping, gig work, and those sorts of jobs? Oh, and I think, Monica, you might be muted. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
There. Please go ahead, Monica.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So on gig work, I think we don't really know yet how these things will work out because we don't have the data yet. I think it will depend very heavily on sectors. Now, just think about yourself during lockdown, which makes it very clear. So transportation gig workers, such as Lyft, Uber, and other driver services, for example, of course, lost a lot because people were locked down, people were afraid. If they had to go anywhere, they probably tried to walk or take a bike or another means of transportation, so that those gig workers were negatively affected. At the same time, food delivery services, those gig workers were extremely busy, and luckily we had them because they were there to keep things going. So it really depends on the different sectors, and for some of the gig workers doing remote work, if telework becomes more and more prevalent, people like graphic designers, web designers, people who work as consultants from home suddenly might have more business opportunities than before because now it's becoming so much more in people's minds that teleworking or remote working is possible. So I think we have to see. We don't have that evidence yet, but we will certainly look at it. On compensation and tipping, that's something that's very difficult to say. But tipping, what we do see is that for people who got large parts of their incomes from informal sources, like tips, for example, or little gigs that they did on the side, and then they apply for unemployment insurance, if they also had a part-time job, for example, then of course all of this money that they earned in informal occupations is never going to be replaced by any social security system or social insurance scheme. So this informal income just drops away and there's no replacement. So that's dangerous, and also shows you that relying on informal payments too much really does exclude those workers from income support in difficult situations afterwards.
Really an interesting question. And we've got another, I think, excellent question for Ida here. And that question is, even in the, in the USA, even after the lockdown has lifted, how long do you think it will be before the inertia of this slowdown is finally overcome?
Thanks, Mark, for this question. Oh, sorry. Sorry?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this question, which is actually a difficult question because, as I said before, there's quite a lot of uncertainty. What we know so far is, as I showed, that the GDP in the US has contracted quite a bit in the first quarter by nearly 5%. And also, as Monica showed, unemployment has risen significantly. So now, to what extent the effects will last will depend on how long the lockdowns that we are seeing in April and May stay on, and this will have an impact on the overall impact on the economy over the whole year. Now, I think that the measures that have been put in place so far, both by Congress and the Federal Reserve, have been quite fast and large, and they have addressed major issues. So, for instance, I'm thinking about the federal government. It has increased Medicaid and also has provided some funds through the CARE Act directly to families, while the Fed has begun to act as a municipal market to prevent liquidity dry-ups, and as I said during my presentation, has done large purchases of both private and public debt. So this is all helping. At the same time, to prevent a longer Fed, what else could be done? As we saw, we are pretty worried about the size of the job losses. So we think it will be quite important to maintain as much as possible the attachment of workers to firms. And also, given the lack of liquidity by some businesses that are shut, it will be important to maintain the liquidity provisions, both in terms of grants and as well as guarantees. And then finally, since probably a lot of the burden will need to fall on the states, on the individual states, it will be quite important that the federal government can help by avoiding that there's a counterproductive tightening of fiscal policy because of the balanced budget rules that certain states have. And then finally, I think it will be quite important that there's close coordination between the federal government and the individual states when they put in place the different containment measures, but also the different specific policies to deal with the economic effects, as to minimize the effects on the economy, on businesses, and people. I will leave it there. Thanks.
No, thank you. I think looking at the clock, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Maybe one more question for each of you is what I'm trying to say. So for Monica, we have a question here that says, there is a cost to support increasing social support programs, yet it was suggested to limit or defer taxes. How does government increase social programs without collecting the money to fund those programs? Where's the money supposed to come from?
Now, that is the $100 million billion question, absolutely. And I think it's really this, and it's really important to ask that question. And it is also conspicuous how absent that question currently is from policy debates. Many governments have come out here to say, well, we will support our workers and our people no matter what it takes. And that's the line right now. And we at the OECD are absolutely on that line with people to say this is such an unprecedented and such a dangerous crisis that it is clear that one really needs to help workers as much as possible. But the phasing out of many of these measures will, of course, be a major question. And it's completely clear that if people stop paying Social Security contributions and don't pay that money into state coffers, then it's going to be difficult for governments to pay for that money. Now, where are they taking the money from? Well, for many of them, it's going to be through debt. Interest rates are and have been for a long time now at historical lows. So maybe if you have to issue extra debt, luckily it's in this situation and not where interest rates were already very high. That's one of the things. Then some countries have been doing a lot of austerity measures in the past and have created some fiscal space. One example, for example, is Germany, which massively reduced their debt burden. And they are now saying, well, we've reduced so much. If we have to go up from 67 to close to 100%, that's just what we're going to do. And the other thing to keep in mind is that nobody thinks that this is going to be a permanent solution. So for now, we're talking about 2 months of lockdown in many countries. And but like I said before, the big question is how we're going to move out of it. And that's where many of these difficult questions will have to be answered by governments.
All right. And I know we are pretty much at time right now, but I think we have, if it is okay with you, Ida and Monica, I would like to ask just maybe one last question. For Ida, the question is it useful, do you think, to prolong life support for jobs and business models that will die because of the virus? And as a corollary, can market forces really find a new structure for the economy?
So thanks for this question, which is a very good question that we are also grappling with, because as I said, many of the measures that have been put in place, they are trying to save companies from a shock that is massive and unprecedented, and to a certain extent is exogenous. Is the pandemic as well as the economic impact at all these close down measures that governments are putting in place. So in a sense, this is affecting viable, not viable companies, affecting all sectors of the economy. So we do think it's important to support these businesses, to provide a lifeline, to ensure that all those that are non-vulnerable survive. And actually, this question gives me the opportunity to talk about a research that we have done in the economics department that is quite interesting. We have looked at how, without government intervention, how this shock would affect the liquidity of firms. And we have seen that without any support from governments, we could have in Europe about 20% of firms would run out of liquidity within 1 month. And it could go as much as 50% of firms running out of cash if the confinement measures last up to 7 months. So this is quite massive. We would see a significant amount of firms that are productive, that are employing people, that they would go under. So these measures, they are needed. They are needed to stay in place. And also we have to ensure, or governments have to ensure, that these liquidity shortfalls that we are seeing, they do not snowball into massive insolvencies. So companies that were profitable before COVID, they need support, and they will also need it after to restart once the recovery starts to kick in. Thanks.
Excellent. All right. I know we have been a little uneven. We got one more question in for Ida, then for Monica, but I do want to be respectful of both of your time, and I know it is late in Paris, so I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to present for us and to share all of this information and to answer some questions from the audience. I'm sure that everyone out there listening in would agree with me that this was a presentation that was absolutely worthwhile and hit on some really big and important ideas and recommendations for moving forward. So thank you. I would remind folks out there listening in that we did record today's session, so please be on the lookout for an email from ACRL and Choice with a link to that recording. And if you have a moment to give us a little feedback, you should see in your chat boxes a link to a survey. Please take a moment to fill that out. We appreciate hearing from you about these presentations. And I would also remind folks that we encourage you to go visit the COVID-19 and policy tracker hubs at http://www.oecd.org/coronavirus, all as one word, /en, as well as the OECD iLibrary.org, data.oecd.org, and stats.oecd.org. For additional information and to answer any questions, you can reach out to Ian Williamson, and that's IAIN.WILLIAMSON@oecd.org. Thanks again to everyone out there for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope the rest of your day is great.